Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Taylor, and I work as a senior fellow at QSide. And it's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Alejandro Ponce, Chief Research Officer at the World Justice Project, presenting on environmental governance indicators for Latin America and the Caribbean.
Hello. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to present today. It is a pleasure to join the seminar. And today I'm going to present a project that we have been working or developing over the last year with the Inter-American Development Bank about environmental governance indicators in Latin America. So for those of you who do not know what the World Justice Project is, so we are a non-governmental organization with offices in Washington, D.C., Seattle, Singapore, and Mexico City. And our goal is to advance the rule of law around the world. We do that, part of the work that we do is related to data. So we have generated indicators on the status of the rule of law around the world, and that was the background of the work that I'm going to present today. So a little bit of the history or background of what we have. So just we know that there are weak environmental government systems in Latin America. Overall, Latin America has made a lot of progress in advancing environmental laws and regulations over the last few years with the creation of several ministries of the environment. However, a key issue is that still environmental performance lags behind. And the question is why this is happening. And that's what is at the core of the work that we did. And there has been several assessments. So, but one of the assessments is in general that the problem relies on governance and the lack of enforcement of regulations or the weakness of the institutions in charge of enforcing the laws that the countries have enacted. So then that was the motivation or one of the core motivations of the work that we did. We started looking at some of the data available. So because part of the problem was that in order to understand better what the situation was, we wanted to look at the data that was available. And it turns out that there is very little available data in this area, not only in Latin America, but around the world. So if we think about the possible types of indicators that can help us understand better the environmental context in countries, we can think about input indicators, for example, and we can think about several of them that matter. So in general, the governance context, or the laws and the legal framework that some of the countries may have. And then on the other side, the environmental performance indicators, and there are several possible indicators in this line, which tells us about the environmental outcomes that we're seeing, just the water quality, the tree cover loss, and so on. And what it's in between is really just all these interplay of factors in charge of either complying with the law on one hand, if we think about citizens, firms, and so on, and governments in charge of applying and enforcing those laws, as well as all the different actors that play a role, either courts, citizens, non-governmental organizations, in either putting some pressure or just aiding the government in enforcing particular regulations through courts. So then, and that's what we're looking at this here. So the output environmental governance, so for example, inspection activities, or many of the indicators that we will see. So broadly speaking, so this is all this information we presented in the report. But broadly speaking, we can think about using the previous framework, a government context, which essentially tells us about the rule of law situation in the country and speaks more broadly about institutions, the power balances in the country, and that we use the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index that can give us an indication on this context, measuring access to justice, corruption, etc. The institutional capacity that some countries may have, we know that sometimes the lack of enforcement is due to capacity issues, so then some sort of measures of institutional capacity. Laws and regulations, in general, it's very difficult to codify whether it's a good law or not, whether the laws actually have certain provisions. The IDB did an exercise, and the UNEP did a very interesting exercise on trying to put a framework to understand this and to codify some of the laws. Then the environmental rule of law in practice, which is precisely what we're trying to do. And then these outcomes, for example, coming from the Yale Environmental Index. So then this project in particular is about this component on the rule of law. So the story is we have some previous studies, both by World Justice Project and the IDB. World Justice Project did an exercise. We did an exercise 3 years ago, a pilot study in 6 countries. And the idea again was to generate indicators on environmental governance in practice. The way that we do that, and I'm going to go in more detail in a minute, is by asking experts in environmental law in 10 countries in Latin America. And overall, the report features about 70 new indicators, and it's relatively comprehensive on the aspects that we are trying to measure. So let me tell you a little bit about the methodology. So what we are trying to measure first, the conceptual framework. So we consider 3 pillars. So the first one is what we call environmental rule of law. And what this is trying to capture is the set of institutions or the performance of the institutions in charge of applying, enforcing, or generating incentives for different actors to comply with the law. And that has to do either with regulation and enforcement, civic engagement, fundamental environmental and social rights, the application of those rights in practice, and access to and quality of justice. This framework, the original framework was developed by UNEP, and we adapted that framework to develop the indicators. So the framework was, there was a report, a global report on rule of law without data really, it was more about the framework, and we adapted that framework to develop indicators. We notice also just that the rule of law framework is useful from a conceptual point of view, but we understand that in practice, the environmental practitioners actually work more by themes. So then what we tried to supplement information in pillar 1 was through practices by environmental theme. Surprisingly, there are not a lot of resources on best practices on the environment. So there were a couple of handbooks that we used to codify some of these best practices by theme in order to try to assess how in practice these practices were applied or not along different dimensions that you are seeing in the screen: quality of air, water, waste management, biodiversity, forestry, and oceans, and so on. And the third one was that we realized that another way of coding this is by sector, so by industry. And we realized this a little bit later, so then we only included extraction and mining, but we realized there are some other industries that we at some point we will need to evaluate. So the background was an exercise that we have been doing as part of the Rule of Law Index. The Rule of Law Index is an exercise to quantify the status of the rule of law in 140 countries or 128 countries around the world through close-ended questions in which we ask practitioners and the public in these countries about day-to-day situations that are manifestations of the rule of law. Or that can tell us something about the status of the rule of law. In general, just these are lawyers, practitioners who are working in the country. So we follow a similar methodology, but applied to environmental law and environmental governance. So we developed questionnaires. So these are some questions that you may see. The questionnaires were extensive. We identify in each one of the countries, lawyers, NGOs, practitioners working on environmental law, communicated with them and invite them to participate on a pro bono basis. All the platform, just essentially we had a platform online in which we invite them to participate. This is an example of some of the questions. This in particular is about regulation, and we invite them there to participate. Once we had information, we map it to a series of indicators using the conceptual framework that I showed before, normalize the questions, and put them in a way that could give us some information about the specific aspects of environmental rule of law and practices. So this is just very broadly speaking the entire process. So as I mentioned, there were some pilots first, then we developed that help us develop the questionnaires, then the conception framework, then we identified more than 3,000 practitioners in the 10 countries assessed. Then just we invite them to participate. We have about 500 in-country practitioners in the 10 countries, so more than 50 per country. We got more than 230 question level variables that we map into different sub-indicators, and finally some indicators. We codify them and then cross-check, did some qualitative tests and interviews to check and validate the data, and then finally publish the report. Some of the key data insights, just very broadly seen. So as we would imagine, there are gaps, large gaps between laws and implementation in each one of the different countries. So what you see here is simply the difference across the countries by questions. This is a question that asks just the difference whether in law something exists and in practice. So this is the average of the 10 countries, and you will see that there are huge differences in a lot of different areas across all the countries. Then going into each one of the specific areas, regulatory enforcement. So obviously just regulatory agencies, just if we think that the score should be between 0 and 1, so the region scores 0.41, and just in general, the regulatory agencies face constraints, particularly related to human capacity and financial capacity. These are two of the indicators that we map, as well as inspection, monitoring, and evaluation. Then going specifically into topics about regulation, in general, probably the most important challenge, even though in some cases the institutions have the mandate, just sometimes coordination among different institutions is a challenge, and this may be within the federal government, but also just across different levels of government or with the provinces. So that's a challenge to actually implement this. Then just this particular one, there are progress in environmental assessments, but in general, just explanations of agency decisions are lacking. And this is really just that we can actually just get all this information, each one of the dots is for a country, and provide information about all these different indicators. Moving to civic engagement. Broadly speaking, civic engagement, just in terms of information, the accessibility of environmental information is there, but there is obviously just an issue of public participation or active public participation, and really act on comments when the public actually comment on some of the policies. Moving to fundamental rights and social rights in general in the case of Latin America. So there is the rights of freedom as association are generally respected. However, the theme of environmental defenders, the protection of environmental defenders, is a serious concern in the region, as we can see on the graph at the right. And finally, moving to the areas, the thematic areas. So we can see, for example, in the case of air quality and water, so that pollution is an issue, just and this crosses across water, air, just that pollution is a concern in the different countries in the region. Then also just we see that countries in general struggle with measures about just best practices in the area of oceans, pollution reduction measures, as we were saying before, but there are other sustainable fishing and so on that is still just the countries still have room for improvement. So this is a general exercise. It's difficult to say anything with 10 countries in a cross-country exercise, but it's simply just to show that what we will anticipate just some relationships with other broader variables such as absence of corruption or institutional capacity. In general, they correlate with the practices that we will see. So countries with more capacity tend to have better practices, and countries in which there is a better governance context, broader governance context, tend to perform better. So development is important. GDP per capita and regulatory enforcement are positively related, and then GDP per capita and biodiversity. No? Again, it's difficult to infer anything else because these are only 10 countries. We present information as well in, more importantly, in the form of country profiles. So this is a country profile for Peru, for example, in which we have all the different information on governance context, institutional capacity data coming from the pages of the countries, but also at the core, all the different information that we have for the indicators collected through this exercise. So I will stop here. So just to say, these results have been presented just to several countries, just to ministries of the environment of several countries. And it's interesting because it's an area in which everybody recognizes that it's important, but in which there is not a lot of information that can guide decisions. And in part because it's a very difficult topic to capture, we recognize that the exercise that we have done has limitations, in part in an effort to cover a lot of areas. It's difficult to go into a lot of detail in specific areas, but it's a good indication of at least showing that it's possible to collect this type of information and point at some areas that may require attention. And this is something that particularly in conversations with governments, they found it quite valuable. So this is again a first effort, and the intention is obviously to expand this to other countries. We have done this only for 10 countries, but to expand it and to probably just link it as well to some other processes that could be interesting to assess. So in particular, some treaties and so in the context of Latin America, just on environmental governance, that could be interesting to link it to the indicator. So, but I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ponce, thank you so much. My head is kind of reeling. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to pivot to the audience first. We have a question in right now that asks, is there also a way to quantify indicators in a way that's not based on opinion?
That's a very good question. So it depends on the subject, and this is something that we tried as well. So the first exercise that we did was, and this is it depends on the subject. So the IDB, for example, did an exercise to try to quantify just the quality of the laws, for example, and this was something that was possible to do just by actually looking at the laws and just comparing them against a framework, and that was more objective. The challenge obviously is whether this tells us something about how these are implemented in practice. What we did was, well, let's try to look at how this is possible. So let's try to look, for example, of objective indicators, either on capacity, budgets, or number of inspections per capita, the outcome of the inspections, and so on. And it is possible, but it doesn't really cover all the aspects. So just number one is you can go into a lot of detail on one or certain specific indicators. For example, inspections can tell us something about inspections. They are not necessarily going to tell us anything else about other areas just of regulatory enforcement. They are useful. Unfortunately, they are, in many cases, the methodologies used to collect this information are not standardized. They are not comparable across countries. That's a challenge. We try to do that. We look at around a lot of different sources. We ask for information through freedom of information requests, and it was really difficult to actually make comparisons. So, and that's for an area that in principle, we should be able to measure. There are some others that are even harder to measure, just on practices. And that's why the challenge is, well, can we get informed opinions or perceptions about how these things are working in practice? At the end of the day, the intention is more to inform policymaking. So, and that's even if it's perception based, it's informed by how just the practitioners are seeing that the system operates, and it's useful for improving.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Another question that we just received: how were the countries that you studied selected? Was it voluntary association, membership, etc.? Are there any measures to include all countries in the area?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the first 10 countries were selected almost randomly. The intention was to have the first 10 countries. We, not entirely randomly, but just we wanted to have countries that represented the different sub-regions within Latin America, countries, large countries, smaller countries, countries in the Indian region, in the Caribbean, and so on. So we picked the countries for the first exercise. The intention indeed is we're in conversations to expand this to the remaining countries in Latin America. So it's still not certain, but that certainly is the intention to cover the remaining countries at least.
Thank you for that. Another thing that some attendees were wondering is, how can a study like yours, a quantitative approach, be used to boost the public participation that you mentioned earlier in your presentation?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. So I think a lot has to do with, so it really depends on the use of the study. No? So the intention of the study was mainly at the beginning, or at least the effort to publicize the study was at the beginning to talk to having a counterpart in the government. So just including just the indicators include public participation to actually point at the particular issues in which the countries were weak, just as it is pointed just in the report. Just there are sub-indicators in the public participation component that were actually targeting just specific areas in which public participation can improve. So then, so first is just identifying the issues and then just having a counterpart with the government. Something that we have been trying to do as well, and this is something that we're starting, is also just going beyond the government and doing just publicizing this more with civil society organizations and so on, that they can use these results as an additional tool or evidence that these issues are issues to pay attention to, that require attention. And then it's essentially just what these kinds of studies provide is a reference point. Just in many cases, we know that public participation is low, but how low? Whether just at least this gives them some reference that it's lower than in other countries, or in a scale between 0 and 1 is actually really bad. So it helps us just to provide this additional information.
Of course. And I have time for one final question. And an attendee asked, what actions, based on your research, do you suggest that governments take first in order to have the greatest impact?
Wow, that's a very difficult question because it really is contextual. No? So it's two things. So one is the findings obviously vary by countries. And so the issues are very different by countries, number one. Number two is that the issues, I mean, it's not necessarily, and this is important to show, the issues is not necessarily just that the indicators show at the weaknesses, but doesn't necessarily show just which indicators should be improved first. Because that is a decision, I mean, that depends really just on the context of the country, the political environment, the opportunities that are available, and so on. I mean, so it may say that there are some areas that require attention, but doesn't necessarily mean that there are some areas that need to be prioritized. I think that is more subject to discussion just within the country, and we don't present the results in that way, that this is a priority area, because the indicators doesn't have the context to provide that kind of solution, just either technical or political to argue just that this is the sequence of steps that you need to take in order to just generate the impact that you want.
Wow, I really appreciate that answer. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Ponce, for such an incredible talk. I have a lot to think about. And thank you to everyone who contributed a question. For anyone who would like to continue the conversation, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now, and we'll be adjourning over there to have some standard Zoom meeting to just talk about this discussion a little bit further. Before we do break, however, I would like to take a moment to announce the winners of our second Q-Side raffle of the day. So we have to celebrate Kristen Drogos, Brittany Judson, and Veronica Chanakel. A Q-Side staff member will be in touch with all three of you shortly about collecting your copy of Dr. Diana Greenwald's latest book.